In the year 2000, for the sixth consecutive year, the editors of Fortune magazine named Enron the most innovative company in America. It was an unprecedented streak. No company had ever held the title for 6 years running. Enron was not merely admired, it was studied, copied, and held up in business schools as the model of what a 21st century corporation could become. 18 months later, Enron filed for bankruptcy. Roughly 20,000 people lost their jobs. Tens of billions of dollars in shareholder value evaporated. And the innovation that Fortune had celebrated for 6 straight years turned out to be the precise mechanism of the largest accounting fraud in American history. This is the detail that makes the Enron story different from almost every other corporate collapse. Enron did not fail despite being innovative. It failed because of what it had been innovating at. The thing the magazines kept honoring, the thing analysts kept praising, the thing that made the stock soar, was the same thing that was hollowing the company out from the inside. The award and the fraud were not two separate stories. They were one story, applauded for 6 years because almost no one bothered to ask what the innovation actually was. That sustained applause, for a company that had quietly stopped being able to tell the difference between earning money and reporting it, was the moment Enron began to die. You would think a company ranked the 7th largest in the United States, generating $100 billion a year, employing 20,000 people, and celebrated by every serious financial publication on earth could not turn out to be substantially a fiction. You would be wrong. Enron in the summer of 2000 was not a company anyone doubted. Enron in the summer of 2000 was the future of American business made visible. On August 23, 2000, its stock reached an all-time high of $90.75 per share, giving the company a market capitalization of roughly $70 billion and making it the 7th largest publicly traded corporation in the country. It reported revenues of nearly $101 billion for the year, a figure that would have ranked it among the largest companies in the world. It employed approximately 20,600 people. Its stock traded at more than 70 times its earnings, a multiple normally reserved for the fastest-growing technology startups, not a company that had started life moving natural gas through pipelines. More than the numbers, Enron had become an idea. It was the company that had supposedly figured out the new economy before anyone else. It had pioneered the trading of energy as a financial product, launched an online trading platform that handled billions of dollars in transactions, and expanded into electricity, broadband internet capacity, and even contracts based on the weather. It appeared on Fortune's list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. Its Houston headquarters was a tower of glass and steel, its trading floor modeled on a Wall Street investment bank. The Financial Times named it Energy Company of the Year. Executives from around the world toured its offices to learn how the future was being built. Enron was not just successful, Enron was the template. It was so woven into the establishment that it funded its own prize for distinguished public service, an award handed out at a Houston ceremony to figures of the stature of Mikhail Gorbachev. The company that would shortly be revealed as the largest fraud in American history spent the late 1990s bestowing honors on former heads of state. Its political connections reached into the highest levels of government, and its decade-long campaign to deregulate energy markets had succeeded across the country. By every external measure of prestige, power, and legitimacy, Enron had arrived. To understand how a company that admired could turn out to be substantially hollow, you have to understand what Enron actually did to produce those numbers, and where the genuine innovation ended and the fraud began. To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Houston, Texas. 1985. Kenneth Lay was the son of a Missouri Baptist preacher who had also sold farm equipment and run a feed store. Lay grew up without money, worked his way through school, and earned a doctorate in economics. He believed, with the conviction of a true ideologue, in deregulated markets, in the idea that government rules distorted prices and that freeing industries from those rules would unlock enormous value. In 1985, he engineered the merger of two mid-sized pipeline companies, Houston Natural Gas and Inter-North of Omaha, Nebraska, and named the combined company Enron. At its founding, Enron was an unglamorous business. It owned tens of thousands of miles of pipeline and moved natural gas from where it was produced to where it was burned. It was stable, regulated, and dull. But Lay saw something coming. The natural gas industry was being deregulated, which meant that for the first time, gas would not simply be delivered at government-set rates. It would be bought and sold at prices that moved. Lay believed that whoever could master gas as a tradable commodity, rather than merely a thing you shipped through a tube, would dominate the industry. He needed someone who could build that business. In 1987, he brought in a consultant from the firm McKinsey to advise him, and in 1990, he hired that consultant away from McKinsey to run a new division. His name was Jeffrey Skilling. Before Skilling fully transformed the company, Enron survived an early near-death that should have taught it a lasting lesson, and instead taught it the opposite. In 1987, an internal audit discovered that two oil traders in Enron's Valhalla, New York office, Louis Bourget and Thomas Mastroianni, had been keeping two sets of books, opening secret bank accounts, and skimming millions of dollars for themselves. Worse, they had made enormous unauthorized bets on the direction of oil prices, and those bets had gone wrong, exposing Enron to losses that nearly destroyed the company. An Enron executive named Mike Muckleroy managed to bluff the market and unwind the positions, reducing a potential loss of around $1 billion down to roughly $140 million. The auditors recommended firing the traders. Kenneth Lay did not fire them, at least not at first, because they had been generating enormous profits, and a memo encouraged them to keep making the company millions. Only when the losses came to light were they finally let go. The lesson Enron absorbed was not that cheating leads to catastrophe. The lesson Enron absorbed was that you can cheat, nearly destroy the company, and survive, as long as the numbers look good while you are doing it. Skilling arrived with an idea that was genuinely brilliant. He called it the gas bank. The problem with natural gas was that producers never knew what price they would get, and buyers never knew what they would pay. Skilling proposed that Enron sit in the middle. It would sign long-term contracts to buy gas from producers at agreed prices, and long-term contracts to sell it to buyers at agreed prices, and it would manage the risk in between, the way a bank manages the gap between depositors and borrowers. Enron would not just ship gas, it would make a market in it. This was a real innovation, and it worked. Enron became the dominant force in natural gas trading, then used the same model as electricity markets deregulated through the 1990s. By the end of the decade, it had launched Enron Online, an internet platform on which Enron was the counterparty to every single trade, buying from one side and selling to the other, capturing the spread on billions of dollars of transactions. For a time, this was a legitimately profitable business built on a legitimately clever idea. But hidden inside Skilling's brilliant idea was the seed of everything that followed. And this is the part that most people miss. To understand the trap, you have to understand a single decision about accounting that Skilling insisted upon. When Enron signed a long-term contract to deliver gas or energy over the next 10 or 20 years, how should it record the profit from that deal? The conservative answer, the traditional answer, was to record the profit as the cash actually came in year by year over the life of the contract. Skilling rejected that. He demanded that Enron be allowed to use a method called mark-to-market accounting. Under mark-to-market, Enron would estimate the total profit it expected to earn over the entire 20-year life of a contract and book all of that estimated profit immediately in the quarter the deal was signed. He made adopting this method a condition of building his trading business. Regulators approved it for Enron in 1992. Consider what that meant. Enron's reported earnings were no longer a record of money it had received. They were a prediction of money it hoped to receive, sometimes decades in the future, calculated using Enron's own assumptions about what prices would do. If Enron signed a 20-year deal and estimated it would generate $100 million in profit, it could report $100 million in profit today before a single dollar had actually arrived. The earnings were real on paper and imaginary in the bank. And mark-to-market accounting created a trap with no exit. Once you have booked 20 years of profit from this year's deals, those deals can never contribute to earnings again. To show growth next quarter, you need new deals, bigger ones, generating even larger projected profits. The treadmill can never slow down, because slowing down means reporting a collapse in earnings. Enron had built a machine that required ever larger bets simply to stand still. The numbers told the story of the machine. Between 1996 and 2000, Enron's reported revenues grew by more than 750% from roughly $13 billion to over $100 billion, an expansion of around 65% a year in an industry where 2 to 3% was considered healthy. That was not the growth rate of an energy company. It was the growth rate of an accounting method. The mark-to-market device produced moments of pure fiction. In 2000, Enron announced a partnership with Blockbuster to deliver movies on demand over the internet, years before streaming existed at scale. Using mark-to-market, Enron booked $53 million in profit from the projected future of the deal. The technology did not work. The partnership collapsed without ever earning a single dollar. But the $53 million had already been reported as profit, and the stock had already risen on the news. The culture compounded the problem. Enron paid its deal-makers bonuses based on the projected value of the deals they signed, not on whether those deals ever made money. So employees signed enormous, splashy deals around the world, booked the imaginary future profits, collected real bonuses, and moved on before anyone could check whether the projects worked. Many of them did not. Then came the second device, and the man who built it. In 1990, Skilling had hired a young finance executive named Andrew Fastow, and in 1998, Fastow became Enron's chief financial officer. Fastow's specialty was a structure called the Special Purpose Entity, an off-balance sheet partnership. Here is how it worked in practice. When Enron owned an asset that was losing money, or carried debt it did not want investors to see, Fastow would create a separate partnership, give it a name, and sell the troubled asset or the debt to that partnership. Because the partnership was technically a separate entity, the loss and the debt disappeared from Enron's books, and when Enron needed to manufacture a profit, it could sell an asset to one of these partnerships at an inflated price and book the difference as income. Fastow named some of these partnerships LJM after the initials of his wife Leah and his 2 sons. He ran them personally, on the side, and earned tens of millions of dollars doing it. By 2000, Enron had created more than 3,000 of these entities. Together, they concealed an estimated $25 billion in debt, hiding it from the investors and the credit rating agencies who believed Enron was far healthier than it was. This is the forensic center of the entire story, and it is what the reframe demands you see clearly. The mark-to-market accounting and the off-balance sheet partnerships were not a fraud committed by an otherwise sound company. They were the company. Strip away the projected earnings that had not arrived, and the debt that had been hidden, and the dominant dazzling, most innovative company in America was a far more ordinary business, losing money on most of its grand projects and surviving on the appearance of growth. The innovation everyone praised was financial engineering. It was the art of making the numbers say whatever Wall Street needed them to say. Enron had stopped being able to distinguish between the money it earned and the money it reported, and once that boundary dissolves inside a company, every decision that follows makes a terrible kind of sense. The clearest expression of what Enron's celebrated innovation actually meant in the real world came in California. In 2000 and 2001, California had deregulated its electricity market, exactly the kind of free market Kenneth Lay had spent his career championing. Enron's traders moved in, and they discovered that the rules of the new market could be gamed. They developed trading strategies with names that would later become infamous: Death Star, Get Shorty, Fat Boy, Ricochet. One scheme involved routing power out of California and selling it back in at inflated prices. Another involved scheduling power deliveries. The grid did not need, then profiting from the congestion. The result, for ordinary Californians, was soaring electricity prices and rolling blackouts. Enron traders were later caught on recordings laughing about the people whose power they were cutting off. The company made close to $2 billion from its Western electricity trading during the crisis. This was the innovation. The most innovative company in America had discovered that the most reliable way to make money in a deregulated market was to manipulate it. This is not a story about a fraud that was uncovered by regulators or police. The first serious warnings came from outside observers asking simple questions, and Enron's response to those questions revealed more than the answers ever could. The earliest of those warnings appeared in September 2000, when a Wall Street Journal reporter named Jonathan Weil wrote an article examining how energy companies, Enron foremost among them, used mark-to-market accounting. and pointed out that outsiders had no way of knowing what assumptions those companies were using to generate their reported profits. The article ran only in a regional edition and attracted little notice, but one reader took it seriously. A short seller named Jim Chanos read it, pulled Enron's annual financial report, tried to understand how the company actually made money, and could not. He began betting against the stock. The professionals who looked closely at the numbers were quietly reaching a conclusion the celebrating public had not. In March 2001, a young reporter at Fortune, the same magazine that had crowned Enron Innovator of the Year for 5 straight years, published an article with a quietly devastating title. It was called, "Is Enron Overpriced?" Her name was Bethany McLean, and she had been tipped off by a short seller who could not understand how Enron actually made its money. McLean asked the obvious question that no one in the financial press had asked. How does a company with a sterling reputation and $100 billion in revenue remain so opaque that no one, not even the company itself, can clearly explain what it does or how it earns a profit? When she put her questions to Skilling, he did not answer them. He told her that people who raised such questions had not studied the business and wanted to throw rocks at the company. The implication was that doubt itself was a form of ignorance. It is April 17, 2001. Skilling, who has just been promoted to chief executive, is hosting a conference call to announce Enron's first quarter results. The numbers he reads out are spectacular. More than $50 billion in quarterly revenue, triple the figure from a year earlier. Then a hedge fund manager named Richard Grubman, who has been betting against Enron stock, comes on the line and asks a simple, reasonable question. Why, he asks, can Enron not produce a balance sheet or a cash flow statement along with its earnings, the way every other financial institution does? It is the single most basic question an investor can ask. Where, precisely, is the money? Skilling's composure breaks. On the call, broadcast to every analyst following the company, the chief executive of the most admired corporation in America replies, "Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that, asshole." The traders at Enron's Houston headquarters loved it. The company's advertising slogan at the time was a single phrase printed beneath the leaning E of its logo. The slogan was, "Ask why." In celebration of their CEO insulting a man for asking exactly that, the traders printed posters reading, "Ask why, asshole," and hung them around the office. The conclusion they drew was that anyone questioning Enron was an enemy to be mocked. The correct conclusion, the one the rest of the market slowly began to reach, was that a company that responds to a basic question about its cash with contempt does so because it cannot answer the question. The warning was clear, it was early, and Enron's leadership treated it as an insult rather than a symptom. But it gets worse. In August 2001, everything accelerated and entirely in the wrong direction. On August 14th, Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned as chief executive after only 6 months in the job, citing personal reasons. Wall Street was baffled. The architect of Enron's entire trading model, a man who had spent a decade clawing his way to the top of the company, was walking away at the apparent moment of his triumph. Only 6 months after finally winning the job he had wanted for years, with the stock already sliding from its peak toward $40. Kenneth Lay resumed the role of chief executive, and almost immediately he received a memo. The memo came from Sharon Watkins, a vice president in Enron's corporate development division who had been examining Fasto's partnerships and had understood what they were. Her 7-page warning told Lay that she was incredibly nervous. The company would, in her words, implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She laid out the structure of the off-balance sheet entities and explained, from inside the company, that the accounting would not survive scrutiny. She was not a regulator or a journalist. She was a senior Enron executive telling the chief executive that the foundation of the company was a fraud that was about to be exposed. Lay had the warning in writing, in detail, weeks before the public knew anything. The company commissioned a review by its own law firm, which had helped structure the partnerships, and the review concluded there was nothing seriously wrong. Then, the structure began to fail in public. On October 16, 2001, Enron announced a third-quarter loss of more than $600 million and a reduction of $1.2 billion in shareholder equity tied directly to Fasto's partnerships. The very next day, the Wall Street Journal published the first of a series of detailed investigations by reporters John M. Schwiller and Rebecca Smith, exposing the LJM partnerships and the precarious structure beneath Enron's reported success. On October 22, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry into Enron's accounting. On a conference call, Fastow admitted he had personally made tens of millions of dollars running the partnerships on the side. A staggering figure for a sitting chief financial officer who claimed to spend only a few hours a week on them. Banks informed Enron they would not extend further loans as long as Fastow remained. On October 24, the board removed him. As the company's troubles became undeniable, the credit rating agencies began cutting Enron's rating notch by notch toward junk. And here the trap that Skilling and Fastow had built closed completely. Enron's entire trading business depended on one thing: its creditworthiness. Enron was the counterparty to every trade on its platform, which meant that every trading partner had to trust that Enron would be able to pay. The moment its credit rating fell to junk, no one would trade with it, and the trading business, the real engine of the company, simply stopped. Lay made a final attempt to save Enron by selling it to a smaller rival, Dynegy, which agreed in November to acquire the company. But when Dynegy's executives examined Enron's books in detail, they found the situation far worse than disclosed, and on November 28, they walked away. The credit rating collapsed to junk the same day. Throughout all of this, Kenneth Lay was telling his employees that everything was fine. In an online chat with employees in September, he said Enron stock was a good buy and that the company's accounting methods were legal and entirely appropriate. He urged employees to keep buying shares and predicted a significantly higher stock price. At the same time, Lay was selling. In the 3 months from August to October 2001, Lay personally sold more than 900,000 of his own Enron shares while publicly insisting the company was sound. He was not alone. Between 1999 and the middle of 2001, Enron executives and directors had quietly sold more than $1 billion worth of stock, cashing out of the company while telling the public and their own workforce to hold on. What followed was a swift and brutal unraveling. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. With $63.4 billion in assets, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in United States history at the time, a record it would hold only until WorldCom collapsed the following year. The stock that had traded at more than $90 18 months earlier fell to 12 cents. Roughly 20,000 people lost their jobs, many of them learning of their dismissal with no warning, carrying boxes out of the gleaming Houston Tower that had been a monument to the company's invincibility. The cruelest detail was the retirement savings. Enron had encouraged its employees to hold their 401k retirement accounts in Enron stock, and many had built their entire futures on it. During the autumn collapse, the company imposed a lockdown on the retirement plan while it changed administrators, a blackout period during which employees were forbidden from selling. They were forced to watch, unable to act, as the stock that held their life savings fell toward zero. An estimated $2 billion in employee retirement money was destroyed. One driver for an Enron-owned utility in Oregon watched a retirement account once worth more than $340,000 dwindle to roughly $1,200. The executives had sold $1 billion of stock near the top. The workers were locked in at the bottom. The destruction radiated outward. Enron had not committed its fraud alone, and the collapse exposed how many respectable institutions had been paid to look away. The investment banks had structured and financed the partnerships and continued to issue favorable research while the company crumbled, with analysts rating Enron a strong buy nearly until the day it filed for bankruptcy. The law firms had blessed the structures, and the auditor had signed off on all of it. Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world, and Enron's auditor, had approved the fraudulent books and had then begun shredding documents as the investigation closed in. In June 2002, it was convicted of obstruction of justice and surrendered its license to practice public accounting. A firm of roughly 85,000 people worldwide effectively ceased to exist. The Supreme Court would overturn the conviction in 2005 on a technicality, but by then there was nothing left to save. The speed of the end was its own kind of verdict. A company that had taken 16 years to build, that employed 20,000 people and ranked 7th in the nation, went from a $90 stock to bankruptcy in a matter of weeks. In 2002, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the most significant overhaul of corporate accounting rules since the Great Depression, written specifically so that what Enron had done could never be done so easily again. Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty, cooperated with prosecutors, and served roughly 6 years in prison. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted in 2006 and sentenced to 24 years, later reduced, serving about 12. Kenneth Lay was convicted in the same trial, faced decades in prison, and died of a heart attack in the summer of 2006 before he could be sentenced. Today, Enron exists only as a cautionary tale. The company was liquidated. Its pipelines and assets sold off to pay creditors who recovered only a fraction of what they were owed. At its peak, it was the 7th largest company in America, valued at roughly $70 billion, employing more than 20,000 people, and honored as the most innovative company in the nation 6 years in a row. Today, it employs no one. Its name survives as the standard reference for corporate fraud taught in every business ethics course written into the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and preserved in the documentary made about its fall titled after the phrase used to describe its leaders: the smartest guys in the room. Enron was not a great company that committed fraud. It was a company whose fraud and whose greatness were the same act, praised for 6 consecutive years because the people doing the praising did not understand, and did not try hard enough to understand, what they were looking at. Mark Toe, market accounting, and the off-balance sheet partnerships were not a betrayal of the most innovative company in America. They were the innovation. The energy trading that dazzled Wall Street and the market manipulation that darkened California were not two different businesses. They were one business, admired when it was called genius and prosecuted when it was finally called what it was. And the company that asked the entire country to admire its brilliance had, in its own advertising, printed the one instruction that would have exposed it if anyone had been willing to follow it. The slogan beneath the leaning E was 2 words long. It said, "Ask why." For 6 years, while the awards piled up and the stock climbed and the retirement accounts swelled with paper that would turn to nothing, almost no one did.